In 1855, the territory beyond the Appalachian Mountains still contained regions where no white man had driven a stake into the ground, built a shelter, or set a single trap. But those regions were shrinking with every decade, pushed back by the slow and relentless expansion of the American frontier westward. The fur trade, which had transformed entire villages into distribution centers and financed expeditions for decades, was still a serious economic enterprise, with established market prices for every type of pelt, value tables published by major trading companies, and hunting seasons that dictated the rhythm of life for men who could spend months without seeing a town. In that world, there was one assumption nearly every young man carried with him when he arrived at his first trapper camp. It seemed reasonable. It even seemed obvious. And it was almost always wrong. The assumption was this: the larger and more dangerous the animal, the harder it was to capture. A grizzly bear from the Rocky Mountains, weighing over 500 pounds and armed with claws capable of shredding tree trunks like paper, inspired immediate terror. A gray wolf of the plains, even the largest specimen of the species, rarely exceeded 130 pounds. In terms of direct physical threat, the difference was absurd. But in terms of difficulty of capture, the hierarchy reversed completely. And the trapper who failed to understand that soon enough lost entire hunting seasons without ever understanding why. The bear, despite all its crushing strength, could be captured with relative consistency once the trapper mastered two basic principles: the proper weight of the deadfall and the irresistible power of honey as bait. The wolf required the trapper to completely abandon the mindset used to capture any other animal. It demanded starting from scratch, rethinking every touched surface, every footprint left behind, every branch handled with a bare hand. The wolf was not difficult because it was large. It was difficult because it possessed a level of suspicion that, to the men of 1855, seemed to go beyond pure instinct. Understanding why these two animals required opposite mindsets was not merely a technical matter. It was the difference between a man who accumulated equipment and a man who truly learned how to read what was happening inside a predator's mind before it ever appeared at the trap. The first principle governing bear capture had nothing to do with the size of the trap. It had to do with understanding what drove the animal. The black bear, called musquaw by American trappers, operated according to a logic dominated by its sense of smell in relation to food. When it detected a scent it desired, especially honey, fermented fruit, or fresh meat, its caution visibly diminished. It moved directly toward the source. It did not stop to analyze the geometry of logs around it. It did not memorize that, weeks earlier, there had been the strange scent of metal or man in that location. It simply advanced. In the trapper camps of the time, this behavior was basic knowledge passed from experienced men to apprentices during the first weeks of an expedition. A trapper arriving in the territory without this understanding learned through loss. Traps set in the wrong places, bait stolen without triggering the mechanism, nights wasted rebuilding what could have been done correctly the first time. Time was a scarce resource during trapping season. Every wasted week translated into pelts that would not reach the market before prices dropped. The second principle governing bear capture was the reading of its movement habits. The black bear followed beaten paths, routes it had already traveled, trails connecting feeding grounds to resting areas. These paths could be identified by the trained eye through deep tracks in mud, claw marks on tree trunks along the way, and the characteristic depression left in low vegetation by the animal's weight. Once the trail was identified, trap placement ceased to be trial and error. It became geometry. The bear deadfall was, in 1855, one of the oldest constructions in the professional trapper's repertoire. older than steel traps, older than the organized fur trade, inherited from indigenous techniques, and adapted through generations of practical use. Its effectiveness depended entirely on precise calibration, not simply brute size. The mechanical principle was simple. A heavy log suspended in unstable balance would fall onto the animal once it displaced a trigger piece while attempting to reach the bait. But executing this principle on a bear-sized scale involved a chain of dependencies that rendered the trap useless if any single link failed. The falling log needed enough weight to incapacitate the animal on impact. For a black bear, this required a large diameter log, often reinforced with smaller logs stacked on top to increase total mass. The trappers of 1855 working throughout the Midwest or along the Rocky Mountain slopes selected such logs with the same care they chose their expedition supplies. Dense wood, free of internal cracks, heavy enough to leave no doubt about the result of the impact. The log was then suspended by a system of 3 posts and 2 horizontal crossbars functioning in interdependent balance. The main vertical post, planted inside the capture area, carried the weight of the suspended log through notched fittings. A second post outside the structure supported the crossbar balancing the first. The third, also external, held the opposite end of the second crossbar. Constructing this system using only materials from the surrounding forest. No nails, no purchased rope, relying solely on what the terrain provided, was the type of skill men acquired over years of repeated practice and observation of experienced hunters. At that time, there was no theoretical instruction. Everything was learned through observation. The trigger mechanism was the part requiring the greatest attention. A forked branch, approximately 3 feet long, was fixed into the ground inside the capture area, with a flat board tied between the 2 forks. At the junction of the forks, a hole held a rigid stick of similar length. In the armed position, this stick fit beneath the internal balancing crossbar, functioning as the lock preventing the system from collapsing. When the bear entered and stepped on the flat board between the forks, the animal's weight depressed the board. This movement raised the rear stick of the fork, the stick slipped from its notch, the balance collapsed, and the log fell. The calibration required a delicate balance that experienced trappers described in immediate physical terms. The trigger board should sink under the pressure of a lightly pressing hand, requiring no more force than that. If the weight of the log pressed too hard against the stick through the crossbar, the trap required excessive force to trigger, and the bear could steal the bait without setting it off. If the pressure was too light, strong wind or a small animal could spring the trap uselessly. This fine adjustment existed in no manual. It lived in the hands of men who had built and rebuilt the same structure dozens of times. The bait was positioned at the back of the capture area, as far from the entrance as possible, forcing the animal to move completely beneath the suspended log to reach it. It could be placed directly on the ground or attached to a piece of meat. In every case, it was soaked or covered in honey. Honey as bait for bears was more than simple food preference. It was the exploitation of a behavioral vulnerability that the trappers of 1855 understood through observation, without requiring zoological explanation. The black bear could locate beehives from enormous distances by using its sense of smell to track the odor's source through dense forest. When that scent was introduced into an artificial environment, the animal responded exactly as it would to a natural hive, with determination and with a noticeable reduction in its usual vigilance. In regions where the fur trade remained active, honey represented a valuable resource to the trappers themselves, both for personal camp use and as trapping material. Men who spent months in remote territory with limited supplies developed a practical relationship with every natural resource available. Burned honeycomb, whose odor spread through the air with especially penetrating intensity, was frequently mentioned as reinforcement for the primary bait. the sweet smoke of charred comb reached the bear's nostrils at distances the cold bait alone could never achieve. The trapper using honey needed to understand that the bait should never be placed at the trap entrance. Doing so would allow the animal to retrieve it without fully entering beneath the suspended log. The bait needed to force the bear to completely commit to the interior of the structure. There was also a preparation practice separating the patient trapper from the careless one, introducing bait into the trap several days before actually arming it. A bear finding easy food in one location would return. When it found the same place safe for the second or third time, it lost whatever lingering suspicion it may have felt during the first encounter. It was on the fourth or fifth visit that the trap was finally armed. There was a specific moment in field observation that separated the two animals more clearly than any description ever could. That moment came when the trapper examined the ground along a path both animals might use. The bear's track was deep, regular, and followed an almost perfectly straight line. The animal's weight impressed every detail of the paw into soft soil. The pads, the toes, the curvature of the foot. Where the ground was firmer, the low vegetation was uniformly flattened, indicating the animal had passed through the exact same point multiple times. There was no variation in route, no side detours. The bear followed its path. The wolf's trail, when visible, possessed a different texture and a different intention. The tracks were clean but distributed in a way suggesting deliberate variation. The wolf rarely stepped twice in exactly the same place. Sometimes the trail disappeared entirely for stretches. The animal had crossed rock, shallow water, or surfaces that retained no impression. When the trail reappeared, it was not necessarily moving in the same direction. The wolf moved as if it knew it was being tracked, even when there was no evidence whatsoever of recent human presence. This difference was no coincidence, and the more experienced trappers of 1855 understood it in a way zoology of the period had not yet fully formalized. The wolf had learned. Not merely as individuals, the hunting pressure exerted over decades on wolf populations throughout the eastern United States had produced measurable differences in the behavior of surviving animals. The wolves inhabiting the Midwest and prairie regions during that era were descendants of those that had survived generations of exposure to traps, poison, and active hunters. Their suspicion was not merely generic instinct, it was instinct refined through enough accumulated time to shape behavior consistently. The great packs that had swept across the eastern prairies decades earlier, attacking livestock and farms with a frequency that made the gray wolf a genuine economic threat to settlers, were retreating. Not because they had been entirely exterminated, but because those that survived had learned to avoid regions with heavy human presence. The wolf encountered by a trapper in the wilder territories of 1855 was an animal carrying within its behavior the record of everything its species had learned about traps, about men, and about the smells that preceded danger. Underestimating that accumulation was the most expensive mistake a trapper could make. The scent of a human being, especially the scent left by a bare hand touching any metal surface, any broken branch along the trap path, any disturbance in the soil, was processed by the wolf as an immediate warning sign, not as a suspicion worthy of investigation, as a command to flee. A wolf detecting recent human odor in an area would not approach to inspect it. It would divert, widen the distance, and might never return to that area with the same regularity again. The smell of tobacco, common among field men of the era, a deeply rooted habit in 19th-century trapping expeditions, had the same effect. A trapper who had smoked while walking toward the trap site and then adjusted the bait with bare hands could compromise weeks of preparation with that single gesture. The trail of his path, carrying tobacco residue at every step, had already told the wolf everything it needed to know before it ever approached the trap. This completely reversed the logic of working with bears. With the bear, the central question was, is the bait attractive enough? With the wolf, the central question was, have I removed every trace of myself from the trap environment? If the answer to the second question was no, the first became irrelevant. Even the hungriest wolf would not approach a trap that smelled of man. This was the lesson experienced trappers passed to apprentices during the first weeks of an expedition. Not through formal instruction, but through practical observation. The apprentice who carelessly set a wolf trap and returned days later to find it untouched, with the animal's tracks clearly circling it at calculated distance, understood all at once what it meant to respect that animal's sensory abilities. The preparation of a steel wolf trap began before any decision about placement or bait. It began with the trap itself. The Newhouse traps, which became the professional standard during that period, manufactured in progressive sizes for animals of different scales, were treated by professional trappers with particular care before every season. The metal of a new or untreated trap carried the smell of the factory, grease, and the hands that had handled it during manufacture and transport. That smell needed to be removed. The most common method was to smoke the trap over damp wood fire long enough for the smoke to fully penetrate all metal surfaces. Alternatively, the trap could be rubbed with melted beeswax or fresh animal blood, masking the metallic odor beneath a scent the wolf did not associate with danger. From the moment the trap was treated, it could no longer be touched with bare hands. Deerskin gloves, a constant item in the kit of every professional trapper of the period, were considered the minimum requirement. Some trappers rubbed the gloves with fern leaves, sweet fern, or skunk cabbage before touching the equipment. The objective was to ensure that the metal, chain, and every associated surface smelled like the natural environment rather than human intervention. The clog, the weight dragged by the trap once the animal was captured, needed to be substantially heavier than the kind used for foxes. For wolves, the standard was roughly 20 pounds. But there was a specific technical reason why the clog was not fixed to a stake in the ground, a reason the trappers of 1855 understood through direct experience. A captured wolf pulled with brutal force in its attempt to escape, and a chain anchored to a fixed point created constant tension the animal could exploit rhythmically with its own body weight, until either the chain snapped or the paw tore free. The grappling iron, a multi-pronged iron hook that buried itself deeper into the ground as the animal pulled, was preferred because it moved with the wolf while continuously increasing resistance, without creating the constant tension point of a fixed stake. Transporting the prepared trap to the installation site required the trapper to organize his movements in advance. Each trap was wrapped in natural material, moss, leaves, to avoid collecting new odors during transport. The installation site was selected after weeks of prior observation, visited multiple times without bringing the trap, solely to map the animal's movement patterns and identify the natural funnel point where any passing wolf would be directed by the terrain itself to step in a specific location. The scent trail for wolves functioned differently from physical bait. While the bait remained at the fixed point of the trap, the scent trail extended the zone of influence in every direction, reaching the wolf before it came close enough to physically inspect the site. The compounds carried by professional trappers of 1855 in their field kits included a selection of oils and powders that today would exist only in historical pharmacy records or expedition supply inventories. Asafoetida oil, extracted from a plant in the carrot family with a pungent and penetrating odor, was considered by many the most effective for wolves. Oil of rhodium, cumin phenol, powdered fennel, and fenugreek were used both separately and in mixtures each trapper adjusted through personal experience. These compounds did not exploit appetite the way honey exploited a bear's hunger. They exploited territorial curiosity. The wolf was drawn towards scents it did not recognize as belonging to its established territory. The trail could be created in two primary ways. First, rubbing the compound onto the soles of boots before walking toward the trap, so that every step deposited a small quantity of scent along the route. This created a continuous olfactory line the wolf could follow from a distance all the way to the trap point. Second, dragging between traps a piece of meat soaked with the compound, creating a scent trail connecting multiple capture points in sequence. A useful technique when the trapper maintained a long line of traps scattered across vast territory, as was common in larger-scale expeditions. In every case, the compound needed to be applied near the traps, but never directly on them. The wolf following the trail needed to encounter a gradual transition of intensity, not an artificial concentration abruptly imposed upon the natural forest environment. The choice between deadfall, steel trap, and twitch up for wolves was not merely technical, it was also economic within the context of 1855. The commercial value of wolf pelts in the fur market of the time was real and influenced every trapper's decisions. A well-preserved pelt was worth more than a damaged one. A large deadfall, when properly calibrated and accurately triggered, produced a quick kill that minimized fur deterioration. A steel trap, if the animal remained captured too long before being found, could damage pelt quality. The twitch-up, by contrast, immobilized the animal quickly if the snare was strong enough and correctly positioned. The number 4 steel trap, the standard wolf size in Newhouse tables, had a clear advantage in terms of visual discretion. Buried carefully and covered with moss, leaves, or ashes, it occupied minimal volume within the environment. A log deadfall, requiring visible support structures, was far more difficult to blend naturally into the surroundings without triggering the wolf's caution. In that sense, for an animal highly sensitive to unnatural geometries in its environment, the buried steel trap was often the more effective choice. One of the most reliable methods for wolves involved placing the trap within a shallow pool or stream, with the bait, the carcass of an animal, positioned beyond the trap in the water, forcing the wolf to step on the trap pan to reach it. Water solved two problems simultaneously. It erased the trapper's tracks from the soil and diluted any lingering human scent that might have remained on the trap during transport. Another effective method involved positioning bait between two logs or closely spaced trees, with one carefully concealed trap on each side. The two traps covered the space any front paw of the wolf would need to occupy to reach the bait. Each trap was attached to its own properly weighted clog. In both cases, every mark left by the trapper on the ground needed to be erased before leaving the area. There was one detail about wolves the trappers of 1855 knew well, and that any apprentice learned quickly, often through a genuine scare. A wolf caught in a trap would sometimes pretend to be dead when the trapper approached. It was no exaggeration. A wolf detecting the trapper's approach after hours or days of captivity could lie completely still, relax its body, close its eyes, and appear, in every observable sense, lifeless. For a man working alone in remote territory, days away from any camp or settlement, this possibility carried immediate practical consequences. Approaching a captured wolf under the assumption that the job was finished was a mistake an experienced trapper never made twice. The behavior revealed something the trappers of 1855 lacked scientific language to define, but recognized operationally. The wolf did not merely learn before capture. It continued operating through caution and assessment afterward. The distrust that made the animal so difficult to deceive with a trap did not disappear once the trap closed. It remained as the final line of defense when the animal no longer had any means of escape. For the trapper working alone, the correct procedure was to observe from sufficient distance before approaching closely. Any movement in the flank, any subtle tension in the neck muscles, any shift in head position at the sound of footsteps. These were the signs separating a dead animal from one still waiting. The kind of knowledge described here was not found in books on the shelves of American towns in 1855. It lived in the hands and memories of men who spent entire seasons in remote camps, passing what they knew to apprentices arriving without experience, and who would have only 1 or 2 seasons to learn before needing to operate on their own. Part of that knowledge survived. Part of it disappeared when the lines of transmission were broken, when the fur trade entered decline, when the great territories were closed, when the generation that knew passed more quickly than the generation able to learn. If this type of practical knowledge, the contrast between how bears and wolves needed to be treated, and what that difference reveals about reading animal behavior, resonates with something in you, this channel will continue building that conversation. Each video explores another layer of the same world. Technique born from observation, and observation born from genuine respect for the complexity of what those men faced. When one truly understands why bears and wolves required opposite mindsets from the trappers of 1855, one thing becomes clear. The true limit of those men did not lie in the size of their traps or the variety of compounds carried in their field kits. It lay in their willingness to abandon the logic that had worked for the last animal when the next demanded an entirely different one. The bear rewarded the presence of irresistible bait. The wolf punished any trace of human presence. These two principles, placed side by side, reveal that trapping was never a single system of capture. It was always a collection of distinct systems, each calibrated for a specific kind of animal mind. Mastering one did not teach the other. Sometimes it even hindered learning, because it created the habit of trusting an approach that had worked before. The men who headed west in 1855, carrying a pack of traps, and little more than the instruction received from an older trapper carried within that instruction, the synthesis of generations of trial, error, and repeated observation. The remaining question is not about technique. It is about the willingness to unlearn enough to discover what the next animal requires. The forest of 1855 did not answer that question with words. It answered with tracks circling an empty trap in damp soil. And it was up to the trapper to decipher what that silent detour was trying to say.